Welcome to the Story Fulfilled podcast, where we deep dive into how each character and story in the Bible come together to fulfill the story of God.
I'm Fletcher.
I am Jay.
And I'm Abby.
And today's episode is about the next person in the genealogy, Jacob.
All right, so we love to start our episodes with a question, and we have questions in our show notes, but I decided to go off the rails today because in our discussion today we're talking about wrestling. I thought of a fun question. If you could put together a biblical tag team,
oh my gosh,
who would it be? And what would the name of the tag team be? So who are your two tag team wrestlers, biblical, and what would the name be?
That's a hilarious question. I love it.
Okay,
do you have anything?
I have one.
Okay.
I'm still waiting on the second one, though. Okay, just say what you're going to say.
Okay, I just, off the top of my head, as I'm saying that, I'm like, okay, who would I put together? And I've got Samson and Nehemiah, and they'd be called the Hair Brothers, just because Nehemiah grabs people by the hair at that one point, and then Samson's hair.
Would you add Absalom to the Hair Brothers?
Oh, yeah.
His long flowing locks.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm sticking to, maybe he'd be the manager.
Okay.
Absalom would be like the creepy manager on the side of the ring.
Oh, that's
who's
good.
Sneaking, like, weapons.
And I'm assuming we can't use two of the same. I can't steal Samson because he's probably a good
Let's
wrestler.
go. You have to pick someone else.
Somebody
someone
original.
different.
That's good. Well, I'm going to pick Jacob because even though he's not the strongest man, he's kind of a weaselly little guy. He doesn't let go, and that's what we're talking about today. But
right.
as my second person, it's a tough one.
Better not steal mine.
No, I try not to. I'll try not to. Man. Abby, go ahead.
I got
sprung
this.
it on us really,
So the first one that came to
for stealing
mind
from the notes.
for sure for me was Elijah, because he prayed and then a bear came and attacked. So
Right.
that's like having an extra person is having
That's
that
right.
bear,
That's
right?
right.
So I'm picking Elijah and King David. I'm going to go with that.
You've inspired me, Abby. There's a great story. I don't know if it's in Kings or in Samuel, but David's Mighty Men. There's 30 of them. I'm going to take one of them. David's Mighty Men. One of them. I don't know the names off the top of my head.
Now,
but they took on some crazy feats.
I'm wondering, Elijah's bear, would that be the same bear that, it wouldn't be, I guess, but the bear that David punched in the face, right? Because David says that he killed a lion and a bear with his bare hands. So,
okay.
So that there might be a conflict of interest there, where like you got Elijah the bear,
And David's
That's
punching
true.
Elijah's bear.
Yeah. Every time that bear comes out, David's like, I gotta punch him. He's gonna steal my sheep. Wow, we just went off the rails there.
For sure.
Yeah, let us know what you
Hair
would
Brothers.
pick.
Yeah,
Email
let us know.
us at story@bfmca.org and let us know what you would pick.
Yeah,
Your wrestling
who's
team.
your tag team?
Tag team wrestlers. All right, so back to the story at hand. We're talking about Jacob. He's found in Genesis 25 through 50. He's a very major character in the Bible.
Just a couple chapters.
A couple chapters. And as we go through these stories, we encourage you to go read them. We try to tell them as best we can and as much as we can to get you interested in knowing about the Bible. But we have to miss a lot because it's only like a half hour. And it's a vast story. So go read the story if you want to get the context in full. It's a great one. So, background for today's episode. Jacob's the grandson of Abraham and the son of Isaac. His mother is Rebekah, who's found by a servant of Abraham back in Mesopotamia, which we talked about last week because that's where Abraham was from. And he's the great-grandniece of Abraham. We were talking before we were go for it.
We think that it's the great-grandniece based on the verse here. So in Genesis chapter 24, verse 15, it says, "Before he had finished speaking, behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor, came out with her jar on her shoulder." So that's kind of like my sister's cousin twice removed, kind of an idea, and then you got to figure out what that actually means. We think that we've landed on great-grandniece. So if you want to double check that, you can also let us know.
Well, we're doing a podcast about genealogies. We're messing up what it's called. So for historical dates-wise, it's Isaac is born about 1860 BC. He married Rebekah in 1820 BC, and our main focus today, Jacob, is born in around 1800 BC. Again, none of these dates are exactly right. because it's such a long time ago, it's almost impossible to figure out exact days. They didn't exactly have birth certificates back then, or maybe they did, but we don't have them. Isaac lived in the land that his father was promised. It's in Canaan. And Rebekah was from Mesopotamia, and again was the great-grandniece of Abraham. There's a cool story of how Rebekah was chosen to be married to to Isaac, but we'll not talk about that today. It's in Genesis, like we said. And here's geography with Abby.
I should have like theme music.
Abby's notes.
Abby's notes. Cliff's notes. There we go. So for geography, we start in the land of Canaan. So Canaan is modern day Jordan, if you're familiar with that. So in the Middle East, and that's where Jacob is born. And then just like last week, we have places like Bethel and Beersheba, which are in northern Israel, also known as Palestine. And this was the land that was promised to Abraham and his descendants, but not yet acquired. And then in this story, we see Jacob going back to Haran, which is in Mesopotamia, which again is the Middle East area, and that's where Abraham lived before his calling.
Yeah. And so on a just kind of a theological note here, Jacob in this story has an encounter, which is kind of where our question of the day came out of. It's called the theophany, which is it's a fancy word that means seeing God. And we see a number of these throughout the Old Testament where God appears in human form. And this isn't to be mistaken with Jesus, but it is God taking on a human form and having an appearance in that way. And so there's a little bit of debate around that. And I think we debate that because of our understanding of the Trinity and who God is and who Jesus is. And Jesus only came when he did come. But we see these encounters throughout Scripture. And so, but yeah, there's debate about that. But I think we agree that there's very little debate to be had that it was actually God that he saw. Jacob himself even says that he saw the face of God and that he lived, which just talks about that encounter as being God himself. And
instead of just an angel or something
instead
like that.
Instead of just an angel. And so oftentimes when you come across an angel of the Lord in the texts, oftentimes that's actually a theophany that's taking place. So. And
Jacob gets his name changed to Israel, and he talks about how he's wrestled with God or striven with God and striven with man and prevailed.
Right.
So the angel or God himself said that you've wrestled with God.
Yeah.
In the text.
Yeah, that's right. He affirms that it's him who's actually
who's wrestling.
The appearance.
Do you like what you're hearing? Remember to like, subscribe, and review on whatever platform you're listening on. It helps us to reach more people with this incredible story. Now, back to the show.
Let's start our story before Jacob is born. His mother, Rebekah, is pregnant and prays to God. And he says to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 people from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. That's Genesis 25:23. And this gives us a good start to the story. The older shall serve the younger, and you'll see kind of what that means as the story unfolds. So Jacob and Esau are twins. Esau the older, and Jacob is the younger one. It says in my script, Esau is flavored by his father, but it's actually favored by his father.
He is favored.
Flavored by his father because he was a good hunter and he could give him meat, and Jacob was preferred by his mother, Rebekah. He was more of an inside kind of kid and not as manly and strong like Esau, I guess is the best way to put it. So one day when they're a little bit older, Jacob is making some lentil stew. And his brother comes in and asks him for some because he didn't catch anything on his hunt and he's starving. And Jacob says no. So we already see Jacob's not the nicest guy, but he says, if you give me your birthright, I'll give you some soup. And Esau said, what good is my birthright if I'm going to starve to death? And he ends up trading his birthright for some lentil soup. So what it is the birthright is an entitlement to double share of the father's inheritance. So it's a big deal. It's not a small little thing.
Right.
And what the little question I have is, does this say more about Jacob or does this say more about Esau, which being deceptive or not caring about what you're going to get from your
right?
inheritance?
And I think it's such a I'd love to see this in a movie form, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
But like, this is Esau is actually, he's so overdramatic. Like, how hungry are you?
Yeah.
Do you really think you're gonna die
Yeah.
because you're so hungry? And I mean, you're this skilled hunter, right? So like, anyways, but I think it really, really highlights Esau's disregard for what the Lord had for him, because the birthright in this instance. So I mean, in ancient Mesopotamia, we've got the birthright meaning inheritance and land and livestock and all this stuff, and it was setting you up for success, wealth, and prosperity moving forward. But in Jacob and Esau's situation, it's so much more than that. They've grown up with their father, who has told them, like, you are sons of Abraham. You're my, so he's Isaac, obviously, but you are sons of Abraham. There is a blessing that's been given to Abraham, and we are a part of something so much bigger. And so their inheritance is tied to so much more.
It's
and
not
really,
just land and flocks and herds and all that.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's tied to a lot more.
It's tied to being the blessing, and being, ultimately, we know now as we take a step back, the line of Christ. And Esau says, what do I need God for? I'm okay. I can do it by myself. Although here he is claiming to be dying of hunger. But he sells his birthright because he has a disregard for what God has for his life and the plan for him, which should have been to carry on the line of Christ. And he's so willing to just give it up. And we see later on in Scripture, God says, Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. And that really, for me, highlights, it's not, and we have questions about that too. We're like, does God hate people?
Yeah.
Right? And because it says, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. Again, it has more to do with Esau cutting himself off from God himself, saying, I don't need God. I'm self-sufficient. I can do this for myself. I don't need what he has for me. And so there he is. And so I think some people take this and they're like, oh, Jacob, he swindled his way into the birthright. And so there's like righteous deception.
Righteous swindling.
Yeah. And I mean, you've got to do some, mental gymnastics and righteous swindling of your own to come to that conclusion, because that's not what's happening here. Esau is letting go of that which has been given to him.
All right. So in that, we move on. So Isaac is now very old and blind, and it's time to give his deathbed blessing, which is a very common practice in ancient times, and it's a very important and big deal, and it can't be taken back once it's been given. So Isaac calls his favorite son and his oldest son, Esau, and he tells him to go out, hunt, and get him some of his favorite food and bring it to him. Rebekah ends up overhearing this and jumps into action. She kills a goat and cooks it for Jacob, and then gives it to him and says, go get your father's blessing. He puts on a goat skin to seem hairy like his brother. We didn't mention that.
How hairy is the guy?
He's got to be incredibly hairy for a goat to feel like. It's actually a young goat, so maybe a little softer. But and he ends up tricking his father into giving him his blessing. He's blessed with prosperity. Nations would bow before him, and he would be lord over his brother. And Esau goes into the tent and asks for the blessing, but Isaac can't give it to him because he said it's already been given. And he gives him a different blessing. He says he will struggle with the earth and live by the sword, and he would be under his brother. Esau ends up swearing to kill his brother once his father dies. And Rebekah tells Jacob to leave, and he ends up going to Haran, where Rebekah was from.
Talk about, like, family dynamics, right? Christmas dinner around that table. I don't know. I wouldn't want to be there. It's a little tense.
It's wild. What I like to think is, how well did Esau know his kids?
Right.
I'm not a father. You're a father, but I think you could recognize your son's voice. I think you could recognize him, even if you're blind. There's a lot of other factors coming in that.
Right.
Sometimes you felt his arm with a goat.
Sometimes I get worked up and I yell and I actually stumble over all of their names and even throw a pet's name in there while I'm trying to search for the right name. But I know who I'm dealing with whenever I'm dealing with them. But I mean, that may even just highlight some difference in family dynamics that we have that never existed back then, which which make it, actually, we have to recognize that, I think, as that makes it difficult sometimes for us to really understand the context of the stories that we read. We have to, that's why it's so important that we do the work to dig in and understand the context of the time in order to understand the text and what it's saying.
All right, so now Jacob is obviously terrified. If I was threatened my life, I'd probably run too. And he leaves and he goes back to Mesopotamia to find a wife. Well, on his journeys, he has a dream of God, and he speaks to him, and he ends up repeating the blessing that Abraham received of the land and the seed, and through his line, all the world will be blessed. And this is, I think, the first time that God was real to Jacob. You know, he's lived his life. He was raised by Isaac, but he hasn't really had a personal experience with God. And he ends up placing a stone and pours oil, and he commits himself to God. And that looks a little bit different than it would today. And we're not going to put up a stone and put up an altar.
Right. But I do think it also highlights, like, and it is important to recognize that he has a response to his first encounter with God. And because of that response, he says, I need to remember this. I need to make note of this. And we see other instances throughout Scripture where people are told even to take stones, like as they're crossing the Jordan, they're told to take stones and set them up as a memorial. We do well to remember our experiences that we have with God, and to make mental note, but even maybe even more than that, physical note. And I think the arts come out of that, right? People write songs, paintings, drawings, whatever, to commemorate their experiences with God, and it's good and right for us to do that.
Great. All right, so Jacob's now in Mesopotamia, in Haran, and while helping somebody out with the sheep, he meets his future wife, Rachel, and he falls in love, and she is considered very beautiful. And he finds out that Rachel is the daughter of Laban, which is his mother's brother. And this was a good thing back in the day. Jacob was told to marry in his family,
Right.
which doesn't mean, obviously, his siblings or his first cousin in this case, but that's something very different now. Back then, it was to keep it in the family was something that was very good and fulfilling, but nowadays it's a little different, so don't go marrying your cousin, I'd say. So Jacob ends up promising...
Good advice on the Story Fulfilled podcast.
Jacob promises to work for Laban for 7 years in order to marry Rachel. It says it felt like a few days to Jacob because he loved her so much.
Right.
It's kind of crazy to think of. When it was time to marry Rachel, they had a huge wedding feast, and Jacob ends up getting tricked into marrying her older sister Leah, because it was their tradition to marry off the older sister. She wore a veil that was in the tent, and there was an old Jewish tradition, actually, that Rachel was even in on the deception and helped her sister out by getting her to marry Jacob first. And this is just my opinion here, but I think Jacob was probably a little bit intoxicated during this wedding feast.
Yeah,
to mistake his future wife for the sister.
I don't think that that would be a stretch given the culture and the traditions. I think, I mean, it's amazing that this story of deception, the eldest and the youngest switching places, as it comes out of the deception, and the eldest and youngest switching places in Jacob and Esau as well. It's not accidental that these things are happening this way.
Right. So Jacob's pretty mad about what just transpired. Laban tricked him, which I really like because Jacob has always been the trickster, and now he has been tricked. Yeah. Which kind of gave him a taste of his own medicine. Jacob ends up promising to work another 7 years in order to marry Rachel this time. There's no other siblings, I guess. Right. To trick him into marrying. Later on, Jacob is ready to leave Laban, and he asks for all the spotted and speckled sheep and goats. And this was probably a small portion of Laban's animals, so he agrees. And Jacob ends up watering them in a certain way and breeds them in a certain way and does these weird things with branches and bark and leaves. And it kind of ends up that Jacob's flock becomes way bigger than Laban's, and Laban's kind of dwindles away. And Laban's sons are very mad about this because they think Jacob robbed him. And when you read it, you're like, well, maybe I should go multiply my goats by putting sticks in water and stuff. And I think what it is that Jacob heard from God, and God told him how to do things, and he listened to God. And that has more to do with God blessing Jacob than it does actually using sticks to multiply sheep, I think was an important thing that we noted. Yeah, and I think, I mean, we have wisdom
that we don't know where it came from. We just inherently do things, and we don't know why we do them that way. And I think that's something that's worth noting there as well. Yeah.
So yeah, Jacob's now a quite wealthy man, lots of animals and sheep. And yeah, Laban's sons get very angry at Jacob for stealing their father's wealth. And Jacob now hears from God to go back to the land of his father in Canaan. So yeah, he's on his way back now to where he was from. And guess who's there waiting for him?
Esau. Dun,
Esau.
dun, dun.
So on his way back to Canaan, Jacob sends a message with gifts and animals in hopes to calm Esau down. He kind of wants to taper his anger off, give him gifts, good word. And he receives word back that Esau's coming with 400 men. And that would be intimidating for me. Holy cow. So Jacob is terrified and comes up with another scheme. He ends up splitting his family into 2 camps in hopes that if the first one is ever attacked or killed, he can run away with the second one, which isn't the bravest thing to do. That's something I think is a little bit cowardly, honestly, but
and
wise, but
yeah.
maybe not brave.
Yeah.
Can I just say that I feel like Jacob and Esau have the same vibe and relationship as Thor and Loki?
Fair enough.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah, with Jacob being Loki and Esau being oh yeah, I'm big man Thor. I don't know.
All right.
As you're
enough.
talking.
No, yeah, that's good. So Jacob is now on the way back to Canaan. His brother is probably going to kill him. He's got 400 men after him. And while Jacob was resting in the camp alone, a man came up and wrestled with him all night until morning. And then it says that when the man saw that he wasn't going to win, he touched Jacob's hip and dislocated it and said to Jacob, "Let me go, it's morning." Jacob says, "Not until you bless me," which is funny. They have a little discussion. And then the man asked him for his name. Jacob asked for his name. What is it? How does it go?
Yeah,
Sorry. No, I'm saying it completely wrong. Jacob is asked for his name, and he says Jacob. And the man says, "Your name is no longer Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and man and prevailed."
Yeah. This is my favorite part of this whole story and this whole podcast even.
Yeah.
Because God asks Jacob, "What is your name?" So Jacob says, "Please bless me," right? And God says, "What is your name?" And at that point, Jacob is forced to say, "I am a swindler." Right? This is who his name means
heel grabber, right?
Heel grabber and swindler and deceiver. And he's forced to actually say, "This is who I am. I am a swindler." And he's forced to come face to face with his identity and who he is apart from God. And God says, "Not anymore. Now you are Israel." Right? And he changes his identity. And so, I mean, when we look at this picture, we see that we are swindlers, we are deceivers, and God says, "What is your name?" to us, and we respond. And it's only when we respond in honesty and actually saying truthfully who we are that we allow the power of God to come in and change.
Give you a new name.
Give us a new identity, a new name, and a new purpose even in life. So
he's striven with God, and I really like the word striven with God and man. And we see he's striven with God in the wrestling with him, and he's striven with man. He's striven with Laban. He's wrestled with Laban. He's wrestled with his brother, and he's come out on top through all of it. And that's only by the blessings of God, as we've seen with the sheep and with his brother.
yeah,
So the next day, we see Esau coming with the 400 men, and this is another not great move by Jacob, but he puts Leah and her kids out in front.
yeah, the least favorite.
And then he puts himself with his favorite wife, Rachel, and her kids. And then they end up meeting Esau. And to his surprise, Esau comes up to Jacob and he gives him a hug.
Yeah.
And he says, "I don't need your gifts. I have enough, brother." And he meets his family and invites them all over back to his land. And Esau ends up forgiving Jacob for what he did, because he was successful in his life and he didn't need anything from him. But he forgave his brother, which I really like.
So all that kind of negotiating and trying to figure things out was all for naught.
Yeah.
Because it didn't matter in the end. He had a different idea of who Esau was, which was interesting.
So Jacob was a sneaky, deceptive trickster, liar, sometimes coward. But when he wanted something, he never let go. From being born, holding on to his brother's heel, stealing the birthright and blessing, working for Laban for his wives for like 20 years, and wrestling with God all night until morning, Jacob prevailed. So what is the importance of wrestling with God?
Well, yeah, I think that's it. It's knowing, coming to terms with, or trying to come to terms with what we know about God, and putting that before Him. God, I believe this to be true of you. Is it true of you? And but in that, just that whole the clinging that we see that Jacob does, and us just clinging to God in the wrestling with Him. Through what we believe about Him, and how that may or may not line up with what we see happening around us. I guess it goes back to even when we talked about Abraham receiving a promise but not seeing the promise, the same as the stars are there but not always visible, and we're invited into wrestling with God through that.
Mm-hmm. What I've kind of thought about is there's something about a relationship between people who wrestle with God. I compare it, I guess, to a husband and wife. If you never fight and you always just ignore each other or put it down, it doesn't get any stronger. You're not to be able to work through work through a big fight, work through an argument with somebody. The relationship grows stronger, and I guess that would be the same way with God. If you can work things through with God, you'll get a stronger relationship with Him. One thing I wanted to not confuse blaming God and
right.
wrestling with God.
Yeah.
Jacob had this deep reverence for God, right? He says, I saw the face of God, surely I'm going to die, right? He had such respect for Him, but he knew who he was dealing with, and he didn't let go.
Yeah.
He kept wrestling. We were at a Bible study a couple weeks ago, and we're talking about righteous anger and what that looks like, and Jay holds up his Bible to the Psalms, and he's like, this is what it looks like, people being angry with God, but in a good way.
Yeah.
So it's a really cool thing.
Yeah, because the psalmist always comes back to, but this I know, right? And this, and I'll cling to your faithfulness, and we can let it all out with God. He can handle it. He's not caught off guard by our feelings or our emotions, but in it we have to continue to hold that reverence for Him as well. And in it as well, the wrestling, just like Jacob, we're forced to identify who we are in it and recognize our place.
And so that leads to our final question of the day. How does this story fulfill the rest of the story and is part of the genealogy?
Yeah, so Jacob, or Israel, as he's known from now on, is the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, and that is God's people. And through them, God's promise of Abraham is going to be fulfilled. And we really see that Esau and Jacob, that separating. Esau denied his birthright, and Jacob received it. So it's going to go through Jacob now, which is really cool. So yeah, the land, the seed, and the blessing is the three things that I like to repeat of Abraham's blessing is now through Jacob and his children. So I just like to end with this line of, Jacob was in the hardest part of his life. His brother was probably going to kill him. He's running away from his uncle. In his exhaustion, he met God and he wrestled with Him and didn't let go. So he wrestled all night and held on to God and wrestled with Him.
Yeah,
I like it.
See the blessing carry through. We also see Esau and that kind of that rising up of the flesh. I can do it on my own. And we see Esau's line. We're going to see that continue to pop up throughout the story as we go through as well. And so it's important to recognize our own struggle between the spirit and the flesh as we live our life in Christ.
All right. Thank you so much for listening. It's been a lot of fun. Hope to see you next week. All right. Goodbye.
See ya.
Bye.